Welcome to the Sales Lead Dog Podcast, hosted by CRM technology and sales process expert Christopher Smith, talking with sales leaders that have separated themselves from the rest of the pack. Listen to find out how the best of the best achieve success with their team and CRM technology. And remember, unless you are the lead dog, the view never changes.
Welcome to Sales Lead Dog. Today we have joining us Mark Musselman of MX5 Consulting. Mark, welcome to Sales Lead Dog.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
This is a guy I've been trying to get on the show for a long time, so I'm happy we finally got you here. So welcome to Sales Lead Dog. Mark, Tell us a bit about what you're doing today and your company.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So about 11 years ago, after I came through a family ownership experience for about 20 some years, I started my own coaching and consulting business. So what I do basically now is I've harvested all the experiences I had as a sales leader, organization leader, and I take those skills and I basically am working primarily one-to-one, mostly with folks like you. They're entrepreneurs or they're people who have a senior leadership responsibility. So a lot of coaching one-to-one can be with high-performing salespeople or salespeople who are underperforming, know they have the potential. And then, there's general consulting and business advice that occurs inside that space as well. So I love working at the level of individual. So one-to-one teams, could be a leadership team or organizations as a whole. So I've been doing that now for about 11 years and have really, really enjoyed it.
That's awesome. Mark, share with me how you got your start in sales.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've thought about this question. It really began probably when I was about 12 years old. Truth be told, I was in a neighborhood in Littleton, Colorado, and noticed that there were a lot of lawns that needed mowing, and I had a great lawnmower in the garage. So I went, put the flyer together. Back in those days, we didn't have, the kind of tools we have today. And then I went out and I basically marketed myself to a neighborhood at that early age and developed over time with a partner of mine, a guy named Mark Musselman, and we ended up mowing probably the most number of lawns in, say, I live in this place called Aberdeen Village, in the entire village. And so, started there, and then we would come back and we'd promote that around snow shoveling in the wintertime, all the things that young, entrepreneurial oriented kids would do. And, so I use that as a point of reference. My formal career in sales began when I got hired out of college. I went to CU in Boulder, and I got hired to work for Ernest and Julio Gallo. So, they're one of the kind of giants in, consumer product sales. And that's really where I learned the science of sales.
Right. Are there any particular memories from that, like any crazy stories or anything you have from that time?
Well, back in those times, I'd say the thing that I realized about sales, and it's probably true across whatever, is you have to love what you do, right? And I remember being in a circumstance about near the end of the second year of my time with Gallo, and I found myself in a moment when all my values as a human being were colliding with what I was doing in a moment. I was in a liquor store in Golden, Colorado, a place called Foss Drug. And I'm a big family guy. I come from a big family. And I remember sitting there and being involved in handing out Tots champagne, which is like they had Andre champagne, they had Tots to people coming in. And it was this moment, and I use this story all the time when I talk to people in sales about really making sure that who you are and the values that you adhere to align with the company or the organization and what you're going to be doing. Because if they don't, what happens is what happened to me that night. It was basically the eve of Thanksgiving, and I found myself holding a tray and handing it out. You could do that in those days.
Right.
And this massive confrontation happened inside me. I walked over to the counter. I handed, the guy's name was Lee, handed a tray of champagne glass to Lee and said, "Lee, thank you. I think this may very well be the very last, sample of champagne I ever pass out." I went back home, celebrated Thanksgiving, went back in the next day and handed in my notice. And that was the first place for me it's not, maybe it's not that funny, but it's just like, it was so memorable.
Oh yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and I know so many people, and I work with lots of people who operate outside their value structure, and they live in dissonance, right? And and no wonder they're not happy, and they're not producing, and all those things that salespeople are kind of designed by nature to do.
Right. It's funny, as an entrepreneur, we talk about our core values of our companies all the time. And for me, it made me start thinking about what are my core values, and I thought about it generally, but I never actually sat down and created a list, because I do think we do have to have that or just awareness of what are those lines, where are our lines that define who we are as humans.
Right. Well, I just to kind of segue off of that a little bit, I just had a conversation with a coaching client yesterday. He's an IBM executive, and he's been sort of, let's just say, gruntled. He's not disgruntled, but he's gruntled, right? So he's not all the way there, but he's thinking about where else he could go. And I said, well, if let's imagine for a second, you put yourself on match.com, right? And so match.com has this algorithm that says you're going to go through filters, and it, age, whatever the circumstances are. And I said, let's do the same thing with like where you are in your career.
Yeah.
And so I think in some ways, values formulate the foundation for that filter. And so he was initially thinking about the possibility of moving out of Denver. And then we came through like, what do you value? Well, I value family. Well, where is your family? The family is here. It's like, okay, so we eliminated moving out of Denver. And then we just went one value after another. And what happened for him is he came to this place of just absolute clarity.
Yeah.
And from that, there's so much a human being can do. Yep. And so he found himself empowered, where at the start of the conversation, he was feeling disempowered. And I mean, like broken almost, right? So it was really, and I think you sharing that about what you do with those values.
Yeah.
And you and I both would know. And I think this is a critical thing for salespeople to do. It's like, who are you? What do you stand for? What matters? And then are you doing the things that align with those values?
Yep. I think that's really, really important. As sales leaders, number one responsibility is that revenue number. What are we hitting our numbers? That is where most of the focus is. In your opinion, what should sales leaders be focusing on?
That's a great question. I mean, we could probably spend the duration of this conversation just on that one question. And I don't say this by any means as if I have anything called truth. It's just a reflection of my experience. And, I think from a leadership perspective, there's this awareness that when I'm working with you, you're a whole person, right? And you may have the most phenomenal skill set as a salesperson, but there could be something, amiss or broken in another part of your life. It could be you're out of shape, you're obese, you have a relationship with your spouse or your partner that's kind of under duress, and, this sense of being lost and adrift. So I think from a leadership perspective, approaching the person who's on your team as a whole entity. Stephen Covey, I think, really did a great job. He used to talk about it around body, mind, heart, and spirit, right? So it's just looking at you as a sort of this 4-quadrant. And I have a model that's like physical, financial, relational, spiritual, and intellectual. And trying to really understand the person as a whole person. Because if I'm coming at you and the symptom is no sales or underperforming sales, and I'm approaching it and I'm not on the thing that is really the cause of that, I could spend a half a year. And in some sales organizations, as you well know, where the sales, process could run a half a year or a year, you can spend an entire year on the wrong thing.
Yep.
So I always like to begin, there's a question that I begin every single conversation with, which is, if I was working with you one-on-one in sales, like, what's the most important conversation you and I need to be having right now?
Right.
And then, instead of me landing something in your world that may not even resonate for you, my goal as a leader, a sales leader, or any other leader, is to listen to that and then say, hey, tell me more about that.
Right.
Why is that something that you want to talk about? And that requires trust.
Right.
It requires openness, and so those things.
So we're, I think, conditioned, and I don't want to make a generalization. Not everybody's this way, but I think most of us, especially when we're in sales, we want to have a sense of bravado and that, we've got it all together. How do you get past that suit of armor to really create that trust and openness to where people are in a comfortable place to where they can open up?
I love that question. I think it begins with the leader demonstrating and having a willingness to be open and vulnerable, him or herself, to start. So one of the things that I like to do, and you already touched on it here, is use stories. My 30 some year career is filled, it's riddled with, brokenness and, lack of results. And I like to connect and say, there was a time when I've worked with other people who have, and then, or discuss a story. And then I might even say, Chris, what did you hear in that story? Or Chris, why do you think I would tell you that story?
Right.
And then let you follow up. Well, you might tell me that story because, and it's great. So go on. What else? Keep going.
Right.
And so I love to use story or metaphors or, analogies to create an opening to a conversation. And you and I, both are probably deeply rooted. And this is what I will give my acknowledgement to Ernest and Julio for training me on, is this whole world of effective open-ended questions, right?
Oh, yeah.
One thing at Gallo that you didn't even do, you never stepped out of their building to be in front of a customer ever until you had mastered the art of effective questions. And effective questions simply are questions that have, no possibility of a yes or no answer.
Right.
And so they create conversation. And what I know about most people is they like to talk.
Mm-hmm. We all have a story.
100, yeah, absolutely. So that, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I would get somebody beyond the armor, by showing them that I don't need to have it. And sometimes in a hierarchically, if I'm, in a leadership role and I'm working, just tell them, like, listen, this is not, there's no perfect, this is messy. I had to learn this way. Here's some mistakes I've made. Let's talk about how this could relate to where you are. And the idea is there's a great phrase, which is falling forward, right? Failing forward, that whole thing. And that's the framework that I like to operate out of.
Yep. I'm a big believer in using failure as a learning tool. What are your thoughts around that, or how do you leverage, those? And I don't like the word failure, but it's, not everything is a win.
Right.
Sometimes you lose. How do you structure that as a learning opportunity as a coach?
Yeah, I think, this is like the core really of the conversation that I tend to be in with whatever client I'm with, whether it's a sales leader or an organizational leader, is this awareness that the value of any experience, and you don't like the word failure, I don't either. I like the word learning opportunity, or the phrase learning opportunity, right? Like, so let's slow down and take a look at what just occurred. And then let's examine it for what we can use as a means to continue to grow and evolve. I'm an enormous, so I was part of a manufacturing organization for 20 some years. We were a sort of Lean Six Sigma, Dr. Deming, black belt environment, and this idea of continuous improvement. So the one thing that I have found is if I use the language of continuous improvement with anybody, it invites them into this conversation that doesn't talk about right and wrong. It's just about continuously evolving.
Yeah.
In order to evolve, we have to have had an experience from which we can evolve. And so, not everything works out, right? I mean, you and I have had probably countless moments that created an opportunity to grow and learn.
Yeah.
I think that the single biggest oversight and is when people don't slow down to debrief.
Right.
And they just run from one experience to the next. And if you're not careful, if I'm not careful, I can accumulate all of that, stuff. And then I can start to get in my head. And then I can start creating stories about all the stuff that I've accumulated in my head.
Right.
And next thing I know, it doesn't matter how skilled I am, there's no possible way I'm going to be effective because I'm in my own head. I may be defeated before the day even starts.
Right. Right.
Right. So, yeah.
As a sales leader, what's the maximum amount of time I want to go before I sit down and do those retrospectives with my team?
Yeah. It's, again, so I'll use a couple different examples. When I first was working at Gallo, we actually met every single day.
Wow.
Every day we had a team of about 7 people with a sales leader, and we would group and gather and we debrief what happened the day before. And this is back in the 80s, late 80s.
Right.
So, it was just a thing that we did.
Yep.
And it must have worked because they were an incredibly successful business, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
are still today.
Yep.
But that's one level of frequency. And then the crazy part in that environment, because they didn't have CRM systems back then, right? It was all hand sheeted tallies.
Right.
So we had to kind of physically gather together to identify what worked, what didn't work, and what course corrections we needed to make for the next day as we went back out in the field. So we would meet every day. And, I've gone at that interval. And then other places where I've been, it's been like once a week. The sales team sort of slows down, talks, jumps up to that sort of 15, 30,000 foot level and just takes a different perspective. Yep. And then there's other organizations that I've been involved in where they might do that once a year as a team.
Yeah.
And I think those are more the independent, manufacturers, representatives that are located, disparately across the country.
Right. Right.
So I think, obviously with what we're doing right now, which is on Zoom,
yep,
it opens up so many channels. I believe that, let me put it this way. There's a quote from, what's the name of the guy from UCLA who used to coach basketball? He won
John Wooden.
So John Wooden has a quote that not every conversation is a good conversation, but no conversation is almost always bad.
Right.
And what he was saying with that is, everything has the potential to be worked through in conversation, where if we stay outside of conversation, then things can get, which they do, made up and misinterpreted. So, I think optimally, if you have the ability, depending on the size of the team, once a week is a great cadence. Once a month is, better than once a quarter. So, it depends on your bandwidth, but I love more frequency because it keeps people more aligned. And one thing I have learned above everything else in sales is that if you have an underperforming salesperson, the last thing that person wants to do is be involved in a conversation that has them talking about their underperformance.
Right.
So if you give time, they'll take as much time as you will give them to avoid the conversation.
Right.
The benefit of a frequency in conversation that's grounded in sort of the what's going on is you're actually helping them.
Right.
It's actually very, very nurturing in the sense that you don't give them a very long time to ruminate in and sort of marinate in the discomfort of being off target, because you're going to have a conversation that, and then it's about how do we draw other people in and having people say, hey, I need help. Yep. I've done everything I can to hit my numbers. And no matter what I do, it's not working. And I would love the help of the team.
Yep.
And that's when really powerful results show up. And, that's the kind of culture in a sales team I like to, sort of foster.
Right. In the tech world where I live, we do daily scrums, daily stand-ups, whatever you want to call it. One of the trends that I see commonly is you will have people that will not really divulge what's going on. They'll just skim the surface in their updates. As a sales leader, if I'm doing, whether it's a daily or weekly meeting, how do I address that? and set the example that, hey, no, I want more, I want deeper. How do I look for that and stay on point myself to make sure that people are really delivering value in these meetings?
Right. Well, I think what you've touched upon is this notion that in order for any team to work effectively, it has to have a platform and a foundation of trust. So people withhold when they don't trust in the condition of the team. With more trust comes more transparency, right? And so, I look at that, sometimes leaders look at the team members as if it's their problem, right? Like they're the ones withholding or but it's really a leadership issue.
Right.
So there's something that I would be looking at in that case, saying, what is it that I'm doing, not doing, saying, not saying, that's prohibiting or interfering with the condition called trust?
Right.
Because what I know is if you have created an environment that's filled and sort of emanates in trust, people will share. Right. And there's this thing that I use all the time called call a thing, and then the what so of, and so when you have like your stand-up scrum meeting and people are withholding, and I'm not by any means suggesting that there's not a condition and culture of trust there, but people are reticent. They don't want to get in trouble.
Right.
So people are working to gain approval, avoid disapproval, and avoid getting in trouble almost universally.
Yep.
And so you, as a organizational leader or a sales leader, embodies the entity that can demonstrate disapproval. Yep. And get somebody in trouble.
Yep.
So you really have to do a consistent and remarkable job at, I think, saying that tone.
Right. I remember reading about, and I forget the gentleman's name, but he came in as CEO from Boeing into, I think it was either GM or Ford, and it was Ford. And they were telling the story about he had weekly status meetings with all the top people that were over all the different product lines. And they had these thick binders to track all the issues associated with their product lines. And when he started the meetings, they used color coding, with it's green, yellow, red.
Yeah.
Everything was all green, maybe a little bit of yellow, but like no red. And so he picked up on that pretty quick. And then he realized, he called it out and said, I'm not buying this. There's no way at an organization this side, there's no red.
Right.
What's really going on? And when he opened up and created that level of trust so people know, hey, look, if I come here and I report a problem, I'm not going to get my head chewed off. Like within 2 weeks, all the binders were just red.
I love it.
Yeah. So now they could really start fixing stuff and making things better, and so it really is. I've always remembered that story, that I'm like, if I'm ever in that situation, it is about creating that trust. So people are like, hey, I'm willing to bring my problem to you and ask for help.
Yeah. And I can tell you from the transition I made in 2009 into this coaching, consulting, facilitation work, as the kind of primary basis of my career now. Yep. I run into all kinds of circumstances where I'll show up in a room with a leadership team and you can hear a pin drop.
Right.
And what that is an indication of, nobody here trusts the leader.
Right.
Because there's no conversation taking place. Yep. And everybody's sitting on their hands and they're biting their lips and they're hoping and praying that I don't call on them, right?
Right.
And if they do, they've probably got an answer. Yep. That'll fit the moment and it'll get them through and by. But there's no real ability to work on anything that's meaningful.
Right.
Yeah.
And see, as sales leaders or any leader, you're failing if people are not bringing you problems. It means just what you said. They're scared.
Right.
There's all kinds behind your door. It's probably total chaos. You have no idea, but you're thinking, hey, everything's great. We're killing it.
Right. And there's this, and there's this delicate balance between the creating a culture that promotes openness and then sort of allowing people to have problems, also work on them, empower them,
Yep.
to come forward with solutions. So I see leaders also who
Yep.
become, they actually create a dependency.
Yes.
And that's another, on the other side of
Yep.
the pendulum,
I've done that.
A line of people out their door, and
Yep.
no one can do anything without them. And that's the other side of the equation.
Oh yeah, I did that when I was a young manager, and I just thought like, man, I am such a great leader. I'm solving all their problems, blah, blah, blah. And then one day it dawned on me, I have created a giant bottleneck in the organization.
Yeah.
I'm not really helping anybody. I've just created a bottleneck.
Yeah. And one of the things I mentioned before in that whole manufacturing, I look at all this stuff through the theory of constraints, right?
Yep.
Just because that's my orientation when it comes to manufacturing. And, if you think about what you just named, you become a massive constraint
Yes.
to the organization. And I see this happen all the time, where a sales leader who, has to insert themselves or assert themselves in every circumstance.
Right.
And so nobody on the team feels like they can do anything without his or her approval, right? Or organizational CEOs, et cetera, who have to sign off on everything and be involved in everything. And like it grinds everything to a halt.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's an awareness on both sides of that pendulum, right? For sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I learned a long time ago that I want to hear about every problem, but when you bring me a problem, I also want to hear your solution.
Yeah.
And let's talk about it and we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome. Let's transition a little bit to talk about one of my favorite topics, CRM.
Yeah.
When it comes to CRM, do you love it or do you hate it?
Well, I'd say it's essential, right? I mean, information as a variable,
right,
in playing the game of business, is absolutely essential. And I remember, my dad was a mechanical process engineer, and he did some amazing work in the center of his career. But he used to always talk about this idea of garbage in, garbage out, right?
Yep. Oh yeah.
So, the thing that I would say of all the sort of variables of a CRM, it's the sales front end of the pipeline, right? And then you and I, people don't want to look bad. They tend to, salespeople are very optimistic. They tend to mostly over exaggerate the possibility of an opportunity, because they're trying to gain favor and look good and hit numbers and all that stuff. So I think this idea of CRM in every way that it can be conceived and experienced is essential. It's as essential as product. You cannot today really function effectively, I don't believe, without a strong, reliable CRM platform. And I think the conversation we've been having up to this point in time really is this: how do leaders create a condition so that when somebody who's interacting with the CRM feels comfortable putting, information in there that's legitimate? Because as you and I both know, I mean, putting in grossly exaggerated numbers there's no system that can function effectively with that. Right. So, yeah, I mentioned to you in, the conversation before we jumped on the call that for the last, 10 years, I've been involved heavily with a real estate company. And, they're like every other, they have a really fantastic CRM platform. And, if you ask realtors who may be probably some of the most optimistic people, what they think they're going to produce over the course of the year, you'll hear people say 20 million. And, you'll be about halfway through the year and they're at like 6 million, saying, okay, you want to adjust anything? No, I'm, it's like that's the challenge, I think, that sales leadership has. Right.
And that perfect segue into my next question. As a sales leader, how do I create an environment of accountability when it comes to CRM?
Yeah, I think, first of all, there has to be a way that as a leader, I can communicate the essential nature of the information that's being input and how it plays all the way through to every other functional area of the business. I think oftentimes leaders, who are in a sales leadership role do not make that connection.
Right.
And so people, salespeople think of it's like, they're forcing me to do this, this is busy work, it's whatever it is.
Yep.
But really, as you and I both know, in every functional area of the business, it depends on what's going in the front end of that system.
Yeah.
And so having the opportunity to slow down, and really, I like to take the entire process and then walk the salespeople through.
Yeah.
This is where we are actively engaged, but let's talk about from here all the way to here.
Yes.
Right. And if you don't make that connection, it's like anything. Context is everything. And I think a lot of sales leaders fail miserably
Yes.
in giving that full context. So then it's just like, well, why do I do that? Well, you do that because everything and everyone else in the entire organization is depending on you doing that.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you stated it perfectly. Like a very practical example is, hey, I'm in operations. I'm looking at your pipeline to figure out who I need to hire, what I need to purchase. I need to prepare, so that when that deal gets closed, we're ready to implement or service or provide whatever it is we're selling. And if that is just pure BS,
yeah,
everyone downstream is making bad decisions based off that information.
Absolutely. And I think about it from a manufacturing perspective as well. Like when you go to, state lead times and you're looking at raw material procurement, everything is driven off of that information. And so I think that's the piece that most salespeople, let's call a thing, right?
Yep.
Most salespeople have a resistance to anything that requires them to put accountability in a system, right? So,
right.
And I think that's, they don't like typically, and these are generalizations, and I want to say that because it's certainly not the case everywhere. Right. But most salespeople, if you think about their profile, they're doing what you and I are doing right now.
Yeah.
It's in the relationship, and then, I've got to switch my left brain to my right brain, or right brain to left brain, and I got to go interfere, and then they just mostly have a block on that.
Yep.
And they're overly optimistic people, which you want, because that's a really great trait to have when you're out working with people and trying to enroll people into your product or service. But when you hit that interface, it causes, you need to have a shift and say, okay, let's really think about this.
Oh yeah.
So I'm in a process right now helping a client of mine raise funds. They're trying to raise for like an initial launch. It's a startup, and I'm in this leadership role helping them, and they've got these numbers in here. I'm thinking, you guys you're not going to ever get off the launch pad because you're all lying to yourselves.
Right.
So let's just stop and literally have a realistic conversation about, do you really think you can get, $50,000 from, person X?
Right.
Yes or no? And if you were going to put some kind of probability on it, what would that be?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it went from like $20 million down to like $1 million.
Yeah.
In a conversation that was asking them to be completely honest and recognize the what so of that moment. And it was hugely, hugely informative.
Yeah.
Because then it was like they were about ready to go out and lease, some buildings and hiring some people and pay, and they have no money.
Right.
That's
a perfect example. Perfect example we're talking about. I remember worked with one client where they had a pipeline. It was the same thing. It was like a crazy number, tens of millions of dollars. But then when I started looking at the pipeline, there was stuff in there that were years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, and I started asking them, like, why are these deals in here? And they're like, oh, we're still talking to them. We still think there's potential there. And I'm like, okay, great. There's another way we can deal with that. But it should be in the pipeline. Pipeline is stuff we're working, that has a real chance of closing sometime in the near future. All this other stuff, we'll carve it out. It'll still be in the system. You'll still have visibility. So, and what I had that moment, it's like for a lot of these people, it's fear or like a security blanket or something, and you have to break them through that.
Completely agree with you. And I will tell you this, I'll use that real estate experienced in the last 10 years as a fantastic example. You'll have a realtor will go to the grocery store, meet somebody in line,
Right.
exchange some kind of, and they think there's a lead.
Right.
It's like, and then they'll put that lead in their system
Yep.
as if it's real, and it's just not.
Right.
Right. But the more leads they think they have,
Right.
the more opportunity. And it's really not about more, it's about qualified.
Exactly. Exactly. And that is a tough concept for a lot of companies where everything is like, oh, that's in our pipeline. And they're skipping over this big step called qualification.
Totally. Yeah. And so that's, I think, the one thing that, as a quote that I love that my dad would say all the time, which is garbage in, garbage out.
Right.
And in sales leadership, I think one of the things that is an inherent responsibility is to validate the accuracy to the best of your ability, everything that goes in the system.
Yep.
And it's no more evident than in a manufacturing organization in particular, because in some cases you're buying raw materials months in advance.
Yes.
And you don't get to send those raw materials back.
Nope.
Right. And obsolescence is the last thing any manufacturer wants. And you and I have talked about obsolescence once before, right?
It'll kill them.
Kill you.
And there's so much complexity when you start bringing supply chain in and all that, so much complexity around that.
If I can touch on one last thing, it's like,
go for it.
I've never met a salesperson really who didn't like a brand new product. Right. And this is another piece of like how, from an ownership perspective, I don't know what kind of products you're specifically bringing to the market. But one of the other things that I've learned over time is that we used to go to our salespeople and say, what do you think? And they, oh, we love it. It's like, and that's a filter.
Right.
But then you also have to run it through a couple other filters, because if you just listen to that filter, you can also be greatly misguided. Because their enthusiasm for pretty much anything new that can help them differentiate themselves. It's like, And so there's a couple of things on the front end, and, you learn that the hard way. Like, when you have either a warehouse or, wherever you hold your obsolescence, it's like, oh, wow. Okay. There's where we made that mistake.
That's right. That's right. Mark, it has been great listening to you. You have terrific insight. I really appreciate you coming on Sales Lead Dog. If people want to reach out and connect with you, what's the best way for them to make that happen?
Yeah, great question. And just to, say the same, I really enjoyed the conversation and, love what you've created here. What an amazing creation in and of itself. So thank you for creating the opportunity and inviting me on. So two ways, probably the most effective way would be either by email, which is Mark with a K, and then at MX, 5consulting.com. So Mark at MX5consulting.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm a very active, almost daily content poster. And it's really just thought leadership that I've got, going up on that. Those are probably the two easiest. And then if anybody wanted to contact me by phone, it's the easiest number in the world, 720-800-1111.
Oh, that is easy.
That is easy. Yeah, I almost feel like I won the lottery on that phone number. So, yeah.
Mark, thanks again for coming on Sales Lead Dog.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
As we end this discussion on Sales Lead Dog, be sure to subscribe to catch all our episodes. On social media, follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Watch the videos on YouTube, and you can also find our episodes on our website at impellercrm.com/Sales Lead Dog. Sales Lead Dog is supported by Impeller CRM, delivering objectively better CRM for business, guaranteed.